Welcome back to yet another section that I'm extremely passionate about. And this one is all about advanced React patterns that are used by senior React developers in the most professional code bases. So, in particular, you're gonna learn about the render props pattern, higher order components, and my personal favorite, the compound component pattern. And we're gonna use this last one to build a few incredible components for our project, such as a reusable modal window and a context menu. Now this section will feel really advanced, especially towards the end of it. And that's because it is really advanced. But that's also the fun of it, because you'll be learning concepts that you won't find in any other React course on Udemy, which is why I'm really thrilled to share this section with you. So without further ado, let's boost your React skills even more. This section is all about advanced React patterns that are used by senior React engineers to make components even more reusable and flexible. So, since this part is about reusability, and since we already talked a lot about reusability before, let's now get a quick overview of how we can reuse different types of code in React and how these advanced patterns that we're going to talk about fit into the picture. So, in React, we basically might want to reuse two big types of code. So we can either reuse pieces of UI or we can reuse some stateful logic. So logic that contains at least one React hook, no matter which one. Now, there's also a third category, which is simply for reusing some non-stateful logic. But for that, we can simply use normal JavaScript functions. But for React, what matters is how we reuse UI and stateful logic. So, as we already know, to reuse pieces of the UI, we use components and props. And the idea is that we use props basically as an API for the component. So, as a way of interacting with the component from the outside so that we can customize how it works and what it looks like. Now, taking this idea one step further, we can even pass in content or other components into components, simply by using this slightly more advanced but extremely useful children prop. So basically, in order to customize not only what a component looks like, but also the content itself. And we already did this many times before, but I just want to summarize everything here. Now, moving on to reusing stateful logic, we already know that we can do so simply by writing our own custom hooks. So again, custom hooks allow us to write our own React hooks, which are composed of any number of any other hooks. Okay, but what if we need to reuse visuals and stateful logic at the same time in some more advanced ways? Well, that's where more advanced patterns come into play. So one of these advanced patterns that developers came up with is the so-called render props pattern. And I say pattern because these are not things that are baked into React, so they're not React features. Instead, they are simply clever ways of using React that have emerged over time in order to solve certain problems. But anyway, with render props, the user of a component has complete control over what the component actually renders by passing in a function as a prop. So this function basically tells the component what and how to render. And the beauty of this is that with this pattern, we can reuse logic that has some UI, so some JSX attached to it, while giving the component the ability to receive even more JSX. And I know that this sounds a bit like the same thing as the children prop, but this is quite different actually. But don't worry about that at this point, because this, again, is just an overview. You will understand this really well in a future lecture when we see the render prop pattern in action. Now, this pattern was actually super common in the old days before React hooks, because it was basically the only way of sharing stateful logic across different components. But today, for that, we already have custom hooks. And so now, this pattern isn't as common as it was before. However, it's still very useful and very important for certain situations in which we really do want to reuse some logic that has some UI attached to it, as we will see in the next few lectures. Okay, and now for the second advanced pattern that we will talk about, we have the compound component pattern. And compound means, in this context, that we will have multiple components that play together in order to create one big, let's call it super component, which is then the compound component. And this pattern allows us to build extremely self-contained components that need to, or that want to, manage their own state internally. So without that state being necessary inside the parent component that uses the compound component. And again, this will make more sense when we see it in action. Now, there are even more patterns than these two, but if you know how to use and when to use these two, that will already set you apart from most of the other React developers out there. And so now, let's learn all about them in practice. So to learn about the render props pattern, let's start by setting up an example on Code Sandbox. So here is the URL for this Code Sandbox that we're going to work with over the next few lectures. And of course, I will include this URL in the resources of this lecture. So the small demo app that we have here is for now simply this one list here. So we have basically a list of products which we can collapse here. And then we also have another button down here, which is basically to show less. And so then it only shows 3 of the products. And then of course, when we click again, it then shows all of them again. So here in our code, we are generating those products here randomly using this Faker.js library. And then I'm also generating here some fake companies, but here you can see that we're actually not using them. Then we have this product item component, which is basically each of these items here. And then we have something similar for a company item, which again is also not being used. And then we have the list itself, which we can see down here is simply included in our app component. So we just include this list, pass it the title of products that we see here, and then those random products that we generated initially. And then here we have a bunch of logic which is responsible for doing this collapsing here that we saw, and for rendering those items right here as a list. So what I want you to do right now, or maybe also after the video is finished, is to check out this entire code on your own and really understand this entire implementation of the list component. Because what we want to do next is to basically reuse this list component also for the list of fake companies. So we basically also want to loop over these companies and for each of them display this company item right here. So for each product, render one item, which is, of course, completely different than the product item. Now, the thing is that here in this component, we have a bunch of stateful logic, which of course we can share using custom hooks. So we could basically create one product list and then one company list, and then have this logic here in a custom hook, and then get that logic into each of these lists using that custom hook. So that would be one solution, but then we wouldn't get the corresponding buttons and the way that everything is laid out. So we wouldn't get any of this JSX here. So this button right here, then this other button, also the logic here of conditional rendering. And so again, all of this we couldn't really get if we were to share this stateful logic here simply using React hooks. So here we really want to reuse both the logic and the UI that we have created here for both of these lists. So product list and company list. So essentially what we want is to just reuse this component that we already have and which contains all the logic and UI that we want to share, but all that we want to be different between the two lists is this part right here. So for the products, we want to render this product item, and for the companies, we want to render the company item components. But now the big question is, how do we actually get these two different components in here so they can be rendered in this unordered list? Well, one idea would be to use the children prop that we already know. So we could grab this entire UL here, and then we could just pass it in like this. And you don't need to write this code. So we could then pass it in like this again. But then the problem is that here we couldn't get access to these display items. So these display items are basically the number of items that can be displayed, which are sometimes all of them, but sometimes only the first three. So depending whether we clicked on that purple button that we saw initially at the bottom of the list. So this doesn't really work, except if we wanted to just use all the products. So then maybe we could make this work, but this is really not ideal because ideally we also want to reuse, of course, this unordered list with this class name. So we would not want to have this here once for the products and then again for the companies, right? So we want to reuse all of this. And again, we also want that functionality of the collapsed list. And so the children prop is really not an option because it is quite limited in the fact that it only allows us to really pass in some content. But here, what we need is not to only pass the content in, but also pass in the instructions on how the items should be rendered. And as you can guess, that's where the render props pattern comes into play. And so let's move on to the next lecture and check out how we can solve this problem using the render props pattern. Okay, and so now let's use the render props pattern to solve the problem that we identified earlier. So the render prop pattern is all about passing in a prop called render, which is a function that a component uses to know what it should render and how to do it. So essentially, whenever you can't directly pass in JSX with the children prop, because you need to give the component a description on how to render something, then you need to reach for this render props pattern. But that still sounds a bit confusing, and so let's just do it. So, as I was saying, here now we will pass in a prop called render, which will be a function. And what will this function be? Well, again, it will be the instructions of how to render something. And in this case, that's actually pretty simple. So for our list of products, we know that for each product, we want to render this product item component, right? So this is what we want to render, and here is how we want to do that. So again, for each product, we want to render one product item. And so let's grab this entire function, which is indeed a function, right? So we grab that and place that here in the render prop. And so then here, of course, we need to receive that prop. So besides the title and the items, we now want this prop called render. And so then here we place that. And there we go. So now our list works exactly the same way as before, but we basically inverted the control of how it should render to the user of the component. So this is what we call inversion of control, and it's an important principle in software development in general. So again, this list now no longer knows actually what it is rendering, right? It has no idea what will happen here inside this map function for each of the display items. All that it knows is that it received this function and that it will call this function for each items in the array. That's it. And so now that this component doesn't know anymore what it is actually rendering, and it doesn't even care about what it is rendering, well, it then makes that very easy to reuse the component for other render props, right? So now we can just grab this list right here and we can reuse it for something else, and in particular for our companies. So here, let's call them companies, and then for each company, what we want to render this time is a company item, right? And then here as the key, we pass in company dot, well, what do we have there? So probably we have a company name, right? And then here, this company item does not receive the product, but of course, instead a company. So company and then company. And on top of that, it does even receive some other prop. So we can also pass in the default visibility. So let's set that to false just to show how different these two lists actually are. So here I want false, not face. And they should, of course, not be a string, but really a Boolean. All right, and so watch the result that we got. So all the logic that we had here before about collapsing the list is the same in these two lists now. So we can collapse both of them. And of course, we also have this button down here. So then only 3 of them are being shown. So essentially, we achieved our goal of reusing all of this stateful logic and also the UI itself. So basically this title here, this button that we have, and yeah, also that other button down there. So we were able to share all of that among these two lists here simply by passing in the render prop again. And so therefore, with this list no longer cares about what it is rendering. It simply follows the instructions right here. And so those instructions in this case are simply what should happen for each of the items in the company's array. So that's in this case here that for each company, one company item should be rendered with these 3 props. While here, one product item component should be rendered with these 2 props. And so again, fundamentally different what we're doing here and what we're doing here. But the important part is that we couldn't only have passed in this component right here, because then our list component wouldn't have any idea about what to do with it. So it wouldn't even know what this company here is if it wasn't for this function right here. So the render prop really always needs to be a function similar to this one. Now, okay, so I hope this made sense and that you understood the logic behind what we just did here. Now just notice that the render prop used to be really the main way of sharing stateful logic across multiple components. So that was before we had React hooks. But now that we do have them, the render props is not that used anymore, except for situations like this one and also a few other even more complex situations. So that's why here I'm not going to go really deep into the details and also really compare all the different patterns. Again, because custom hooks are now usually the way to go when we want to share logic. But that actually doesn't stop us from looking at yet another pattern in the next lecture, which is called the higher order component pattern, which is even less used, but still very important for you to know, even though I didn't even include it in that initial slide at the beginning of the section. But anyway, let's now move there and check out this other pattern. So, as I just mentioned, there is actually another advanced React pattern that I want to quickly show you. Now, this one isn't super important, which is why I didn't even include it in the first lecture of the section, but I still need you to know about it. And so let's now take a look at the higher order component pattern. So basically, we want to do now something similar to what we just did with the render props, but with the higher order component pattern. Now, I would actually say that almost no one still writes higher order components by hand. But I'm still going to show you this because some libraries do actually expose higher order components. And then it's going to be very useful to know what they are. So you don't need to know how to write them. And so in this lecture, I will just quickly show you a higher order component, what it is and how it works, and also why it would be used. So let's imagine that we got this component right here, so this product list, from a third-party library, and that we cannot change it. So we just got this here, and we now still want to add these two toggle functionalities. So this one right here, and also this one. But we cannot change this product list component. So how could we do that? Well, one way would be to write a higher order component to basically enhance or improve this component right here. So a higher order component is simply a component that takes in another component and then returns a new component that is a better, so an enhanced version of the initial component. And here I actually already created this. So right here we have this higher order component.js file. And so let's take a look at it. So that component is this one called with toggles, because it will basically add back those two toggles that I showed you earlier to our component. And that component is the wrapped component that we can pass in. So it's pretty common that a higher order component is called something that starts with this with keyword. So that's kind of a convention, because basically it will add these toggles to the component that we pass in. And so then we have a new component with toggles, right? But anyway, as I mentioned earlier, the higher order component does return a new component. And so that's exactly what we have here. So we return this new list component, which has the identical logic that we had previously. What's special now about this is that here in the middle of all this logic, it does then basically contain that wrapped component. So the component that we are going to pass in. Then here, all the props are going to be spread. So basically to get them from the component that we pass in right here. So this is a pretty common pattern. And then here we just have this items props with this display items that are computed up here. So again, the way in which we write a higher order component is not that important. What matters is that it's usually called something that starts with and that it takes in one component and returns a new one. And that new one adds some functionality to that passed-in component. So it's then returned here together with a bunch of other stuff. And so now we can use this higher order component right here. So let's now create a product list. So similar to the name that we have down here. So a product list with toggles. And so here is that with toggles again. And so this will be the result of calling with toggles. And then passing in the product list component. So this one right here. Maybe let's place it actually here, just to make this a bit easier to understand. So we had the product list component, and then we passed that into the higher order component called with toggles. And so since this returns a component, we then store that component here in this new one. So product list with toggles. And now all we need to do is to use that here. So let's give ourselves another div here with the class name of call2, just to keep them basically in a separate row here. And then first, let's take the products list, so the original one, just so we see the difference. And so this one also accepts a title and the items. So let's call the title here products higher order component, and then the items should just be the products. All right, then let's close these two as we no longer need them. And so then afterwards, or maybe let's even comment this entire row out. So grabbing all of this. And so there it disappears. So again, here we have that initial product list, which doesn't have this button to close it or to collapse the items, right? But now let's duplicate this. And then here using product list with toggles. Give it a save and beautiful. So now we do have the toggle and hopefully the other one as well. And indeed, there we go. And so with this, we reached our goal of enhancing the product list with the features that we wanted it to have. So the features that the other lists also had. So these two toggles right there. All right. So if in any case you ever use a library which exports or which provides you with a higher order component like this, then this is the logic behind that. All right. So you call the higher order component with the initial one, and that will then return you an enhanced component. And this is actually all I wanted you to know about the higher order component pattern. It used to be extremely important in the past, again, before we had React hooks, but now, again, this is all you need to know. And so let's now move on to probably the most important one that we're going to learn, which is the compound component pattern. So see you there very soon. Now let's learn about the most awesome and by far my favorite React pattern, which is the compound component pattern. And as a starting point to this example that we're going to build together, we have yet another code sandbox. And I will share the link to this one, as always, in this lecture's resources. Now let's start by forking this one so that you can get your own copy. And then let's start by understanding what the compound component pattern is all about. So the idea of a compound component is that we can create a set of related components that together achieve a common and useful task. For example, implementing a counter, such as we are going to do in this lecture. But of course, this pattern can also be used in all kinds of components that are actually more useful. For example, modal windows, pagination, tables, and so on. So basically, the way we implement this is that we create a parent component and then a few different child components that really belong to the parent and that really only make sense when used together with the parent component. And a good example of this is the HTML select and option elements. So the select element implements a select box, and the option element implements each of the select options inside the select box, right? So we have used this kind of HTML all the time. And so these option elements can really only be used inside a select element. So they only make sense within that element. And so this is essentially exactly the same principle as we are going to use in compound components. And this will then allow us to implement highly flexible and highly reusable components with a very, very expressive API. And all without basically using no props at all. So after implementing this example and the next ones in the next few videos, you will see the potential for using this everywhere. And let me actually start by showing you how we are going to use the component that we're going to build in practice. And so that will then show you how this really is super flexible and reusable. So let's say that we have a counter, and never mind about this other one that we have here. We will talk about that one in a second. And then let's say we close it here immediately. And then in there, let's say we have a counter.label component. Then we close that. And here, for example, we can say my super flexible counter. Then let's also say we have an increase button. So let's self-close this one. And then here we might want to pass in an icon, for example, like the plus icon. And maybe we also have a decrease component. And all of this, of course, will make more sense when we actually implement this. And then in the end, let's say we also then have a counter.count where we actually display the result of the counter. And so all of this is now super flexible because we could, for example, just move this count here and maybe do the increase here and the decrease here. And maybe we want the label here at the very end, or maybe we don't want a label at all. And so we can very easily configure all of this simply by moving around the components. And the alternative to doing this would be to create tons of props to exactly configure the component as we want it. And so that would then create a so-called prop explosion like we have it here. So here we pass in all these different props for all these things. And then here we, for example, have this one to hide the label, while here we could simply delete this or just simply not write it at all. Or we have hide increase or hide decrease, where again, here we would just have to delete this. And of course, this wouldn't even be enough. So we might have to also define something like position count or something like this. And then here, maybe we have to write top. So I'm just making things up here because this is just to show that without the flexibility of a compound component like this one, we would have to pass in 10 or 20 props to configure it in the same way that we can easily achieve like this. And that's not even the only advantage, as you will see later. So once we actually start implementing this. And actually, let's start doing that right now. So there's no need to wait because we already know what we want to do. So how can we build something like this? Well, first of all, here we have the counter component. And so this one here should probably keep the state of what the count actually is. So let's open up our files, because I already have this counter.js. And so here, let's add that count value. So count and set count is equal to use state. And let's start at 0 and then import use state, of course, from React. And let's also immediately create some simple handler functions here. And let's make them arrow functions called increase. So just set count. And then let's do another one for decrease like this. Great. So this is already a starting point, but really just a small starting point. Because how can we now implement something like this? So, for example, how can this count value, like here, actually know what the current state is in this counter component? Because, I mean, we are not passing any props between here. And so again, how will this component here know what the current state is? Or also, how will this component right here know how to increase the state, and this one how to decrease it? Well, as we just mentioned, we cannot use props for that. But thankfully for us, we have another solution, which is to actually use context. And yeah, you heard that right. We are going to use context to implement the compound component pattern. And so this is a really great use case for the context API. Maybe, if you ask me, even the greatest use case. And so let's create ourselves a new context. So let's call it the counter context, and then create context. And we don't need any default value here. So before we go any further, let's establish how we actually implement a compound component. So the first step is to indeed create a context. Then next up, we create the parent component. So create the parent component. Then afterwards, we need to create the child components that will help implementing the common task of this overall compound component. So basically, those are going to be the decrease, count, increase, and label components. And so then afterwards, in the end, we add the child components as properties to the parent component. And this step is actually optional, but I really like to do it like this. So then we only have to export the counter and the rest will just work. All right, so this is basically always the recipe that you are going to follow when you use this pattern. And so now let's use the context here to provide the state to all our child components. So here we do counter context dot provider, remember. So we haven't used this for some time. So this is also a great refresher. So we want to pass the count, the increase, and the decrease functions here to child components. Let's close this. And then here we will need the children, right? And actually let's wrap them in some other element here, maybe a span. So to make this a bit more flexible even, because if we used a div, that would then create a line break. But then here we need the children prop to then place whatever we pass into the counter. So basically, these 3 or these 4 components here will then become the children. So they will be placed here, and therefore they then get access to these 3 values that we placed in the context. And so let's now actually go ahead and create those components. So that's the counter. Then also the label. Then increase. And decrease. And so now let's implement them one by one. And here this one actually needs to be called just count, because this will only display the value itself. And so now we can use the use context hook, and we then need to pass in the context itself. So the counter context. And then from there, we just take the count value. And then we simply return that inside a span element. Then here inside the label, we just want to accept the children and then basically immediately return them. And also inside a span, so they don't create any line breaks. Okay, and then finally the increase and decrease. So here we need to grab this function again from the context. So use context and then counter context. And then we want to return a button with the on-click prop set to increase. And then here, let's actually accept a prop called icon, so that the user of this component can use that here. And now I will just copy and paste this. So decrease. And there we go. And so now the final step is actually pretty easy. So we just need to place them here on the counter component. And this is possible because this is simply a function. So in JavaScript, we can add properties almost to everything. And so that includes functions. So we can do counter.count should be equal to the count component like this. And then we just do the same for all the other ones. So counter.label will be the label. Counter.increase will be increase. And counter.decrease will be decrease. And that's actually it. This is how we implement a counter as a compound component. Now this might look pretty silly for just implementing a counter, and the truth is that this does require us to write a lot more code, and it might be a bit harder to implement as well. But as we saw earlier, there are also many advantages to this. So let's now deactivate this one right here. Let's then make a hard reload, and it looks like it works. And indeed it does. Great. And so now we can do everything that I mentioned earlier. So we can place this here. So then that changes. We can change here the position of all of the elements inside our counter. And of course, we can omit some of them altogether. So let's create ourselves another instance here. And so this will then appear here right by the side because we decided to make the counter basically a span with this here, right? So maybe let's wrap this one here in a div element. Yeah, that's a bit better. And yeah, as I was saying, we can, for example, just completely omit this one. Can place this in the center. Here, let's maybe use an emoji. So to decrease, we can use this one, and to increase this other one right here. And so look how flexible this is. We could even place this one here, of course, in a div as well. So there's nothing stopping us from also using some HTML in here. And so this, yeah, is just so flexible. And also the state is so nicely encapsulated now inside this component. And it's completely invisible to the outside. And we could keep going here, but I think you got the point, which is, again, that we have all these different child components here that together help implement a common goal. So in this case, to implement a counter. And each of them on their own don't really make any sense at all. So if we were trying to use that outside here on its own, then that wouldn't really work at all. The only thing that might work would be this label, I guess. And even then, I'm not sure. So just making this up. But yeah, so this one would work. But of course, this still doesn't make any sense at all. So this component here really only helps us implementing this bigger counter. And so, yeah, this is how, in a nutshell, the compound component pattern works. And so, congratulations, you now know about the most amazing React pattern that exists. And so, luckily for you, you are now one of the few React developers that even knows that this pattern exists and how to use it. But of course, we need to practice this now a bit more and use it in a more real-world situation. And so over the next few lectures, we are going to implement a super flexible and super standalone modal window component. So in this video, we're gonna go back to our project and build a simple modal window component using React's portal feature, so that we can then convert this modal to a compound component in the next video. So as I have mentioned earlier, here in our cabins page, we actually want this form to add a new cabin to appear in a modal window. So not just here rendered on the page, but we want basically a new window to open on top of this and then display our form in there. And so let's now build that reusable modal component. Now we already have a file for that. So here in the UI folder, we have modal.jsx, which already contains these three styled components for us. And so now all we have to do is to basically assemble these and then use this modal in our application. So just to test this now and to return something, let's use the styled modal component that we have up there. And then let's just render modal. So we have this styled modal here, which contains some styles, and we will actually take a look at that a bit later. So for now, let's just include this modal here. And so for that, let's come to the cabins page. And so right now, here we have that logic where we have the button, and then conditionally based on this state, we display the form. Now for the modal, we will actually have something similar, but let's move all this logic here to a separate component. Because as we said initially, we want all of these pages here to be as simple as possible. So we don't want them to have any state or any effects. So in our cabins folder, let's just create a component called addCabin. And so this is where we will then call the modal. So let's see if we can use some of this right there. So maybe let's grab all of this here, place that here. Also the state, even though we are going to change the name. And yeah, then here let's get rid of all of this. And here simply render that add cabin component. So let's get rid of all of these unnecessary imports. And so this is a lot cleaner. And then of course we need to correct all the stuff here. So importing the state, the button, and then also the form itself. All right, and now I just want to change this name here from show form to is open modal. So is open modal, and just like this. And for now, here, whenever the modal is open, let's just show that modal. So what we just worked on later. So let's re-render this. And so now let's see what happens. And indeed, there is our modal window. But of course, now we want to make this a bit more reusable. And so we will allow this modal window to receive some custom content. And so that content is, as you can imagine, going to be the create cabin form. So for that, we will just pass this in, and then inside the modal, we will use the children prop to receive this form. So here it's actually modal, and here this should be self-closing. All right. And of course, that doesn't change anything here, because now we need to go over the modal and accept the children prop, and then display that right here. Now we don't know what kind of element we are going to get here. And so let's actually wrap whatever children that we receive here, which we don't know what they are, inside a div like this. And so this is starting to look like something here. The styling is maybe a bit off, but we will fix that later. So what matters is that this modal is actually already nicely centered on our page. And so that's because of this fixed position right here, and then this top left and transform. But now let's also use this overlay component here, which will add a subtle background color and will make the background blurred. So that will give the whole thing a bit of a nicer look. So overlay like this. And beautiful. Next up, we also need a way of closing the modal. So that's a pretty common functionality, right? And so we need to add a button here. And again, we already have that button here. And so let's just use it here also inside the styled modal. So button, and then here let's use again an icon from our library. So this one right here. And so there it is. But of course, now as we click here, nothing is going to happen. And the reason for that is that we don't really know how to close this modal, right? So we didn't pass any prop in here, and therefore nothing happens. So how can we actually close this modal? Well, remember that the modal is being opened because of this external state right here. So this state that is actually living outside of the modal, right? So whenever this here is true, then the modal will be rendered. But if not, then not. And so in order to close the modal, we basically now need to pass in this setIsOpen modal function, or at least some function that depends on that. So let's pass in then the on close prop, which will be this function that I just mentioned. So let's create a callback function here, which will set is open modal to false, right? So by calling this function, this will then set the state back to false and the modal will close. So let's accept that prop here on close, and then here we just need to wire that up with the on click event handler. So on close, and there we go. Let's open it up again, because we also want the same functionality whenever we click here on this cancel button. So that also makes sense to close the modal, and it would even make sense to close it whenever the new cabin has been created. So that's something pretty usual that you see in web applications. And so let's try to do something similar. And for that, we have to do exactly what we did earlier, which is to also pass in a prop here with this same function, right? Because otherwise the form has no way of knowing how to actually close the modal. Now here let's even call this prop on close modal, so to be a bit more specific, and then let's come here and then let's accept that prop. So on close modal, and then basically what we want to do, well, first of all, here on the reset button, so this cancel button, let's add the on click prop. And then here we could just use on close modal. However, we do not know whether this form will ever be reused in another place, not inside the modal. And so if this form is ever used in some place where it isn't contained in a modal, then it's not going to receive this on close modal prop, right? And so that means that we need to call this function here conditionally, because again, it might not even exist. And so in that case, if it doesn't exist, then this will create a bug. So let's actually create a callback here, and then we can conditionally call a function with the optional chaining operator. So that's really convenient. And so if this is undefined, then the function will not get called because of this optional chaining operator. All right, now let's copy this and then do the exact same thing also right here. So on success, so after the cabin has been created or after it has been edited, then let's also close the modal. So let's try that with this button, and nice. So that works, and I'm not going to try creating a new cabin because that's not really necessary. Now, since we are already in this form component, let's quickly fix the styling as well. So here we basically want to get rid of all the space right here in case that the form is rendered in a modal. So let's come here to the form and then add a prop here. So then in our styled component, we will receive this prop and change the styling accordingly. Now, the way in which we know whether this form is being rendered in a modal is if it received the on close modal prop. So that's a nice way or a nice trick of checking that. And so let's do on close modal. If it exists, then here we want to create the modal prop. So set the type prop to modal, and otherwise let's just call it regular. All right, and so now let's check here for these two props, so modal and regular. So let's go to our form component, and that again works by hitting the command or the control key at the same time as clicking. Now here we actually already have the code for using those props. So if the form type is modal, then it will get this styling, and otherwise it will get this styling. But here let's actually be a bit more explicit and check for the regular type. So the regular prop that we specified earlier as well. And then let's make that the default prop. So form.default props. So just like we did earlier. So the type by default should of course be regular. All right, so let's check this, and beautiful. So this looks a lot better than before, and it works just nicely. However, there is still one important improvement that we need to do. So we can close all of this. All of this now works nicely. But yeah, as I was saying, let's now improve this here using something called a React portal. So a React portal is a feature that essentially allows us to render an element outside of the parent component's DOM structure while still keeping the element in the original position of the component tree. So in other words, with a portal, we can basically render a component in any place that we want inside the DOM tree, but still leave the component at the same place in the React component tree. And so then things like props keep working normally. And so this is great and generally used for all elements that we want to stay on top of other elements. So things like modal windows, tooltips, menus, and so on. And since we are building a modal right now, I thought it was a good idea to show you this feature. So before we start, let's actually take a look at the current situation. So when we open the modal, let's inspect this. And so here in our DOM tree, well, where is it actually? And yeah, this is the one. So this is basically our modal window. And of course, right now, it is simply inside the DOM structure of our page. So we have our main, and then in there, this is probably the table, and then these are all the rows. And yeah, then after that comes our modal. But now with a React portal, as I was just saying, we can basically render this component completely outside of this DOM structure and really render it anywhere that we want. So let me quickly show you how. So it's actually really easy. So instead of just returning this JSX here, we return the result of calling create portal. So create portal, and this one is actually not part of React, but of React DOM, which actually makes sense because this really is about placing some JSX in the DOM. Now then, this function here receives as the first argument the JSX that we want to render, and then as the second argument a DOM node where we want to render this JSX. And so let's just do this in the document body. And so that we can select simply by writing document.body. All right. But it could, of course, be also any other element as well. And we could select it, for example, using document.querySelector or any other way. But anyway, let's now go back to just attaching this to the document body, even though some developers say that this is not ideal, but actually it does work just fine. So let's just reload here. Then let's open the form. And now notice how the modal window is actually a direct child element of the body element. And so that's because we selected that body right here. And so the reason for that is that here we selected that body element to be the parent element of whatever we want to render. All right. And so this now essentially lives completely outside of the DOM structure of the application itself, which lives right here inside this root div. Now, what's nice about this, as I was saying, is that inside the component tree, the modal is still at the exact same place. And so that's why we can still pass all the props into it that we want. So it's still a child element here of add cabin, even though in the DOM it no longer is. So this portal basically is called a portal because it allows us to create like an invisible tunnel, so like a portal from the place where the component is in the component tree to another place in the DOM tree. But now you might be wondering, this worked really great already in the beginning with just regular CSS positioning, so without the portal. And so why do we even need to use this portal? Well, the main reason why a portal becomes necessary is in order to avoid conflicts with the CSS property overflow set to hidden. So many times we build a component like a modal and it works just fine. But then some other developer will reuse it somewhere else. And that somewhere else might be a place where the modal will get cut off by a overflow hidden set on the parent. So this is basically all about reusability and making sure that the component will never be cut off by an overflow property set to hidden on some parent element. So in order to avoid this kind of situation, we simply render the modal completely outside of the rest of the DOM. So basically on top of the DOM tree, as we just did here. All right. So hopefully this made sense. And with this, we finished our first version of the modal. However, this modal does contain a few problems. And most importantly, the way in which we open the modal. And so that's why in the next lecture, we will actually convert this to a compound component. So let's convert the first version of the modal component that we just built to a compound component. And the reason why that is necessary is that this modal that we have built is really not ideal when it comes to the state management and to the way in which we actually render this modal. So remember how we render the modal right here based on this isOpenModal state. Now the problem with this is that we really do not want the component who uses the modal to be responsible for creating this piece of state and to keep track of whether the modal is open or not. So again, it shouldn't be the task of the add cabin component here to track whether right now the modal should be displayed or not. So instead, the modal component itself should actually know whether it is currently open or not. And so it should keep this state internally. So it should track this basically encapsulated inside the component. And then the component should give us simply a way to open the modal and also a way to pass in the content that we actually want to display inside the modal. So basically, we want some button to open the modal and we want the window itself. So these two components together should form the modal component. And if this sounds a lot like the compound component pattern, that is because, in fact, a compound component is perfect for a situation like this. And so we will now, as I just mentioned, implement this whole modal using a compound component. So let's comment all of this out so that we still keep that code as a reference. And so let's create a new component here. And then let's start by basically creating the API of this component. And so then we will know what we should actually implement. So we want, again, a modal component. So just like before. And then in there, let's say we want that button and a button to open this. So modal open and then the window itself. So let's call this one modal.open. And so it's going to be into this window where we are going to place the content itself. So in this case, that's create cabin form. And then here into this modal.open, we want the user of this component to be able to pass in the button itself. So of course we could make this open itself also a button, but then we would lose a bit of the flexibility of the component, because then we would have to define the style and so on. And so instead, let's allow the user to pass in whatever button they want. And so let's again use our primary button here and then add new cabin. All right. Now, of course, this will create some errors because we didn't implement any of this yet, but well, let's just keep going. So this is already looking like a real nice API, and if you ask me, a lot nicer than what we actually have here. So now we have no more state needed here inside this add cabin component, and instead we will keep that state, whether the window is open or not, right inside the modal. Now just one more thing, which is that we actually want to allow multiple windows. So let's say, for example, we also want one to show a table. So we can then do this. So we have another button to open and another window. So we want the user of the modal component to be able to do this. So basically having multiple modal windows. However, of course, only one of them can be open at the same time. And so therefore, each of these buttons needs to know which window it should actually open. And so therefore, here let's pass in a prop called opens. And let's say this one opens the cabin form. And so then we simply give this window here exactly this name. So let's give this one the name prop and then call it cabin form. All right. And then here, well, let's already pass in some different prop here. Let's say table, and then we call this window here table. All right. And then here, well, let's do this later. So let's comment this one out for now. So this was just to show you that we can have multiple windows inside the same modal component. And so since we have that additional flexibility, then we need to give each window a name, and then we associate each open component here to that name. All right. And as we also just mentioned, then the modal basically needs to keep track which one is currently open. And so let's now go implement all of this here in our modal. And let's duplicate this file first so that you can also keep the original one. And then let's go here. And so now we are going to follow the same 4 steps that we did previously in order to implement a compound component. And the first one is to create a new context. So modal context, let's say create context from React. And so that is the first step. The next step is to create the parent component. So that's what we have here. So that's already called modal, but let's actually call it here window, because the window is what will actually contain this portal and all this JSX here. All right. And so then let's create the parent component, which is the modal itself. And this one also needs to accept children so that then it can display the windows and the opens. Okay, and then here is where we will keep track of which is the currently open window. So let's call that the open name and set open name. So then, of course, we use a use state hook for that, and we start with no empty window. And therefore, we just use as a default here an empty string. Then next, let's also immediately create the handler functions. So let's say close is equal. So closing a modal or a modal window is as easy as simply setting the open name back to the empty string. So this function, all it will do is set open name back to nothing. And the opposite is to open a window. And opening a window is just the same thing as setting the open name. So let's just rename that here. So this is a bit more explicit what is happening. But basically, opening is simply setting this open name, for example, to cabin form. And so then this window that has this name will be displayed. All right. And so we already have that window. Let's create the button itself, or actually the open. So this accepts the children, and as we saw earlier, also the opens prop, while this one accepts the name prop. And the onClose we will remove in a minute. All right, and before we keep going, let's implement the last step as well, which is to place these two as properties on the modal. So modal.open is open, and then modal.window is just a window. All right, and so now let's get to work implementing these. So first of all, in the open component, we will need access to the open function from the context. So use context with modal context. And so now here we want to then return whatever we pass in here, right? So in our example, we passed in this button, and so then we want to return this button from this open modal. However, how do we now actually add the open event handler to this button? I mean, of course, we cannot do it right here, because here we don't have access to any of the internal state and the state updating functions, right? And that's actually the whole point of having the API design like this. So for having a component that we use in this way. And so we need to solve this problem. So again, what we need to do is now a way of adding that open event handler to this button. So to the children prop of open. So basically adding this function here to the children. And the way we can do this is by using a pretty advanced React function called cloneElement. And to learn more about this function, let's actually head over to the React documentation. So I think we haven't checked this out since the beginning of this entire course, but I think it's still interesting to now look up this function. So cloneElement, let's wait for it here. Seems like my internet connection is pretty slow at the moment. But here it is. So first of all, here we see that cloneElement is pretty uncommon. And so one thing that's important to mention here is that you should not overuse the technique that we are going to implement here soon. But anyway, this technique can still be pretty useful because the cloneElement basically allows us to create a new React element based on another one. So we pass in the element, and then we can pass in props, which will solve our problem here in our case. And it's the reason why we're going to use this. So instead of children, we will clone the children. So we will basically create a new version of the children, but with new props. And so those props will contain the onClick prop. And then this onClick prop will become a function that actually opens a modal window. So this function will then call open with the opens prop. So let's actually maybe change this here to make it a bit more explicit. So opens window name. All right, and this is actually it. So since we cannot place that function directly here, what we do is to clone it. So we clone that button, and then as props, we pass in the onClick prop as always when we need to handle an event, and then the event handler function is simply to open the window with this name. So with the name that we have here as a prop. So in this case, the cabin form, right? And so now on the window, we basically need to check which is the currently open window. And if it's the same as this name, then we want to render its content. So let's just do that. So what I just explained. So basically, if the name here is different from the open name, which we will soon get from the context, then don't return anything. So then just return null. But if the name is equal to the currently open window, then, well, then we return this. All right. And so now let's grab the open name and also the close function from the context. So use context with modal context. And then we can finally get rid of this onClose prop because, again, earlier this was actually coming from the outside. So the only way in which we would close a model would be here with this function. And so that was necessary because the state was living outside of the modal. So using this function right here. But since that is no longer the case now, we of course no longer pass this in. And instead we use our internal close function. So the one that we get from the context. And so I believe with this, we are actually done, at least with the basic functionality. So let's check this here, reload, and now for some reason our button isn't there. So, of course not. So I forgot one of the most important parts, which is to even return something from this modal component. And so then of course all the children couldn't even be shown here. So of course we need now the modal context dot provider with the value of the open name, the close and the open functions. And then in here, we want to pass in and render the children. And so there we go. So let's close this. And now as we click here, beautiful, it does open our modal. So it works exactly the same way as before, but now we have this as a compound component. Nice. Now, maybe you notice that the styling is again off. And the reason for that is that the styling here is only applied with the type of modal when this component here receives a function. So let's just quickly review that because this is pretty important. So it is this one right here. And so remember that earlier we passed the onClose modal function into this form. And so if that existed, then here the type of the form would be a modal form. So right now that is not showing up here because we are indeed not passing in the onClose modal function yet. And so let's change that. So right here in our modal is where we will have to pass in that function because again, we can no longer pass it in here. So that's what we did earlier. We passed that function here. But again, now we do not have that function out here, which is actually great. But now that means that we need to pass it in another way. And the way we will do that is exactly with the same technique as here. So we will grab this children and clone it. So clone the children, and then we pass in again props. And this time the name of the prop is called onCloseModal, and we just set it to the close function. And there we go. So immediately you saw that the styling here changed. And now we can also close the modal by clicking on this button and also by submitting here a new cabin. Beautiful. So it's working really great. Let's now just only or also activate this one. So here we want to then display the cabin table. So just to see. So indeed, we get another button, and this one here has this prop. And so therefore now, as we click this button here, the open name will become table, right? So that's the opens prop right here. And therefore, if we click the button here, then the opens function will get called, and then that will set table right here to this open name. Okay, and then here in our windows, one of the two windows will then have the name equal to table. And so that one will then no longer return null, but will instead return our window. And beautiful. Great. So here we now get our table, and here we get our cabin form. Very nice. And with this, actually our work here is done. So I hope that this new implementation of the modal using the compound component pattern made sense to you. Now the main focus here is really on how to use this very important pattern. So don't focus too much on the specific implementation details of this specific modal component. So when you use this compound component pattern in the future to maybe build your own components, then those won't be maybe modal components. And so really what I want you to retain the most from this lecture is really how we can use these different, basically child components to together achieve a goal. So in this case, displaying a modal window. And it's always in the same way. So we have some state and some state updating functions here in the parent component. Then we pass that with a context. And then in the child components, we use those to achieve the goal of displaying a modal window in this case. So I want you to study this pattern here a little bit more, maybe review all the code that we wrote. You can also check out the component tree as always, because it's actually pretty interesting in this case. For example, the fact that we do indeed have all the windows already in our component tree. So here we have the one with the table and the one with cabin form. So they are actually rendered, but they are not rendering anything. So they only start rendering something when this name here is equal to the open name state here. So this one. So if we change this to table, then indeed the table modal window will show up. All right. Then also review maybe this technique here, and you can think of a few other use cases maybe, and also read again the documentation. And then once you're done with all that, so really understanding what we did here, let's move on to the next lecture where we will implement one final missing detail of this modal window. Next up, let's write some code to detect a click that happens outside the modal window. And so when that happens, we then want to close the window. So basically what I mean is that when this is open, and then when we click out here, that modal window should close, which is a pretty common pattern in websites and applications. So of course right now, as I click here, that doesn't happen. And so what we want to do now, again, is to detect whenever a click happens outside of the modal window, or one of its children. So basically, in this case, out here. All right. So let's come here to our window and then add some global event listeners for a click event. So now we will basically go back, so to say, to some more primitive DOM manipulation. So we need to do that inside a use effect, right? And so let's specify our effect function and, as always, our dependency array. So again, here we will now attach right to the document an event listener for any click events. And then here we will have a handle click callback function. And it needs to be in this external function because we also need to remove this. So handle click, which will receive the click event. And so, as I was saying earlier, we also now need to remove this event listener as the component unmounts. And so for that, remember, we need to return a callback function. So we return document.remove event listener .click and then that same handle click. Now here apparently we didn't include use effect, or actually we did if we read the error message here. And so thankfully for us, we have this ESLint rule, which tells us that the React hook use effect is called conditionally. So remember how we learned earlier, way back, that we are not allowed to do this. But if I didn't have this ESLint rule, I might actually have missed this. So then that would have created those kind of bugs that we talked about earlier. But now that works. And so now let's really think about this. So let's open up the window again. And as we just said earlier, we want something to happen whenever we click outside here. So basically, whenever the click event that we are handling here happens outside of this element right here. So outside of this styled modal. So let's then manually select this element using a ref. So const ref will come from the use ref hook. Just like this. And now we can add that here with the ref prop. And then we can use this selected element right here in our handler. So first of all, we need to check if that ref even exists. So for that, we can check ref.current, which is basically where the DOM node that references this element here will be stored. So if that exists, and now comes basically the heart or the solution of this whole thing. So I will just write it and then I will explain it. So if the ref.current, so again, that's this window right there. So if that does not contain the element that was clicked, so e.target, then in that case, close the modal. Now here we are missing something, which is probably that ref, or actually refs are stable, but the close function we do need. So let's recap here. Maybe let's even add some console.log here first. So let's say click outside. And so let's again analyze. So remember that ref.current is now this element right here. So this white modal window. So it's a DOM element right now. And on DOM elements, we can call the contain methods, which will basically return true whenever this element right here contains the element that we pass in. And so in this case, the element we pass in is e.target, which is simply the element where the click happened. So if the click happens on one of these elements right here, then that of course is inside the modal. And so then this whole thing here becomes false, and then nothing happens. But if a click happens out here, then that is no longer contained here in the ref. And so then this function here should get called. So let's see. So now nothing is happening. And as I click, I get this error, and that's because it's called contains. All right, let's remove that. Let's click here, and then nothing happens. But let's try to click outside. And beautiful. So we get our lock, and most importantly, the form closed. So the modal window was indeed closed. All right, now there's just one problem with this, because watch what happens as I click here again. So that's very strange, right? So we get click outside, but the window doesn't show up. So what strange thing is happening here? Well, the reason for this is actually the way that events work in JavaScript, and in particular the fact that events bubble up. So whenever I click here on this button, the modal window will be attached to the DOM, right? And it will be attached right here as a direct child of the body. And so if I click on the button, that event will bubble up all the way through the DOM until it also reaches that modal window. And so then the click is basically detected outside the modal window, which will immediately close that window again. So our logic is actually working just fine. So again, when we click here, the modal window basically gets opened for a millisecond, but then it immediately detects a click outside of it. And so then it will immediately close again. And so the way that we fix this is to not listen for these events on the bubbling phase, but on the capturing phase. So basically, as the event moves down the DOM tree and not up the DOM tree. And if all of this sounds a bit strange, then this is just the way that events work in JavaScript. And I have a whole lecture about this in the section on how React works behind the scenes. So please go back there if this is strange to you. But in any case, we can change this default behavior by here passing in a third argument, which is simply to set this to true. And so if we use true here, then again, the event will actually be handled in the capturing phase. So as the event moves down the tree. So then here, the same thing. Let's just reload here. Let's click, and nice. So that solves our problem. And so that's the reason why I told you earlier that even though we left vanilla JavaScript behind, it's still very important to understand how many things work. Because without that knowledge, you probably wouldn't have been able to solve this issue. And so that fundamental knowledge is still extremely important. So let's just test if the click outside still works, and it does. Great. So this is how any modern modal window is supposed to work. Now, just to finish, let's actually extract all of this here into a custom hook, which is a great exercise not only to practice your React skills, but also to create a very nice and reusable custom hook for you. So if you want, you can pause the video here and do this extraction yourself, and then I will come back here once you are finished with that. All right, so hopefully you tried this, but in any case, let's create that new file right here in the reusable hooks folder. And let's call it use outside click.js, and then a function called use outside click. Let's also export this. And then what we need to do is to basically just grab all the code here. So I will just copy it for now, paste that here, and then of course we need to get everything in here. So what do we need inside this custom hook from the outside? Well, it's actually already marked in red, which is basically this handler function right here. So when we use this custom hook now in our component, we will need to pass in that function. And so let's actually delete this now and call use outside click. And so again, here we now need to pass in that handler. And so that handler is going to be that close function. And so here let's receive that. And then of course here we just call it handler, because this should become really generic. Then here also we need to use handler, and maybe to make this even a bit more flexible, let us here allow the user to specify whether they want to listen for the event in the bubbling or in the capturing phase. So let's call this one listen capturing, and by default let's set it to true. So then here we will replace those with listen capturing. Then we need that here like this. And now let's see the problem that we have here. And yeah, the only thing that we are missing here is this ref. And so that means that this function here should probably return that ref. So let's store that here. And then all we need to do is to export that. So to return that actually from here. And with this, the same functionality should now be encapsulated here in this abstraction. So in that own custom hook right there. So let's see. And beautiful. Maybe just to finish, let's get rid of that console.log. And there we go. Nice. And now next up, let's also reuse this modal here for some other things. So this form right here, or actually not this, but here the edit form is still being rendered down here. And so let's also place that inside a modal window in the next lecture. And now to finish this part about the modal windows, let's reuse it 2 more times. So to edit and to confirm a cabin deletion. So first off, let's clean up this file a little bit. And then here as well. And also, we actually don't want this other window here where we display a table. Also, let's place this modal into a div so that the button doesn't occupy all that space. Okay, and so now, as I was saying initially, let's actually reuse this modal window both for deleting and for editing. So let's come to our cabin row right here, and then let's use that modal window. So basically around these buttons right here. Now this one doesn't belong into the modal window. Let's start, or let's open it right here. All right. And for now, this will of course not do anything, but now let's then start using our child components. So modal open, and then here is where we will place that button. And then what should happen whenever the window is opened? Well, inside that window is where actually we want to now render this create cabin form. So let's remove this, place that here, and then we can tremendously clean up this file. So we can get rid of this state, which we no longer need. The same here for the import. And we also no longer then need to return this fragment. And well, here we also have this onClick handler that we no longer need. And this, and there we go. All right. And so now all we need to do, I believe, is to connect this open with this window. So let's call this one here edit. And so then this button opens edit. And that should be it. So let's see. Nice. So that's the edit form for cabin 001. Let's try with the test, or actually with the 8. And there we go. Great. So see how easy it is to now include a new modal window like this. So really, really easy with this really nice API that we created ourselves earlier. And of course, everything works as before. So this component here basically still gets injected with that onCloseModal function, which allows this to also close this here as we add it. And now let's actually test that. So 007, let's change the price to 700. Let's see. And yeah, as soon as that was done, our modal was closed. Great. So that was one part. And now the second part is that whenever we click here on this button, we actually don't want the cabin to be deleted immediately, but instead, as is usual in normal web applications, first we should get asked whether we are sure if that cabin should be deleted. So for that, we actually already have a component here called confirm delete. So this is a reusable component that can be used for different resources. So basically now we're going to use it for the cabins. So this receives the resource name, then the onConfirm function, which will eventually get called if we are really sure. So if we confirm, and then also the disabled state. And so let's now use this here inside our modal window. So this one also should be rendered inside a modal. So like you have seen many, many times before. So let's create ourselves a new modal.open, which is where we will place this button, and then our modal.window. And so here we now want that confirm delete component. So that receives the resource name, and so that's going to be cabins. Also the disabled state, and so that's going to be is deleting, and then finally onConfirm. But for now, let's not do that, and let's just test if this actually works. Let's say we want to delete this, and great. So now we get this nice window here, but for now, nothing is going to happen. So we cannot cancel, and we cannot delete, but we can, of course, close it. Okay, and so now we need to pass in the function that should actually be called when we confirm. And so that function is actually this one. So before we just called this function directly on the click, but now it should only be called after we confirm. So onConfirm, and of course needs to be here. So here we want that function. And here we can get rid of this and of all of this as well. And now let's go back here and let's then make these buttons actually work. So first of all, we have the cancel button, which should essentially just close the modal. So how do we make this one work? Well, since this is a child component now of the modal window, it will automatically receive the onCloseModal prop, right? So that's what we have been talking about all this time, where, remember, we clone this element and inject that function in there. So giving it this onClose modal prop. And so now that will be created inside confirm delete. So here we have now access to that. And so we can say on click on close modal. And then we also already have on confirm. And so let's place that here as well. So on confirm. And with this functionality should now be working, at least most of it. So the modal opens. When we click cancel, then it closes. Great. But now watch what happens here. So delete, and indeed, the cabin gets successfully deleted. Now, actually, I thought that after this deletion, the modal window would stay open, because nowhere we actually told it to close afterwards. But thinking about this, it actually makes sense, because after we delete the cabin, the row does no longer exist. And so therefore, the modal component inside the row also no longer exists. And so therefore, then the modal window can no longer be shown. And so that's why it does indeed disappear. Now it's time to leave the modal window behind and have some more fun with the compound component pattern by building a reusable table component. But first off, let's fix a small bug in our cabin row. So here we forgot to name the window and the open button. So here, this one is called delete, and the other one then opens delete. Now this didn't change the functionality at all, but just for the sake of completion, let's leave it like this. So if we had another modal window without these props, then they both wouldn't work. But if it's only one without anything, then the name basically just gets undefined. All right, so let's close this and let's turn our attention to the cabin table. So basically right now, this table is really not reusable. Like we have, for example, like these grid columns hard-coded right in the header and I guess also in the row. So what we just closed. So here we have the exact same columns again. So in both places, and they are really this hard-coded. And so this is going to make it really hard to reuse this table for something else. For example, for the bookings. So instead of having this table here, instead, it would be really nice to simply pass the column definition like this one into the table, and then all of the rows in there, and also the header, would automatically get access to the size of the columns. So how could we do something like this? Well, we can actually once again use a compound component. So as I have mentioned earlier, once you know about this pattern, you will start seeing use cases for it everywhere. And so let's do another one here with this table. Now we already have our styles written in our table.jsx. So we have already the styled table itself. Then we have a styled header and a styled row, which are basically based on this common row component here. So that's what we have there. And we have a styled body, footer, and even an empty element. And so here is where we will now build our compound component. So that is going to be called just table. And in the end, let's then also immediately export default that. So let's come back here to our cabin table. Let's actually close this and once again duplicate it, because we will do quite some changes here again. So version 2, and we will work then on this one. And so now here we want to replace this table that we have with the one that we are building right here. So we can get rid of this one and instead use that other table. Now this will of course break everything because that table doesn't do anything yet, but that's no problem. So the role we can also get rid of for now. And so what we were saying in the beginning is that what we want is to pass in the column definition right into this table, so that then we can use that on all the child components. So let's do that. Let's call that prop columns, and then let's just make it a string, and exactly this one right here. So basically we're going to take advantage of the way that CSS Grid represents columns and use that here. And so then here we will want to use a table dot header. Then here for now let's leave it like this. And in the cabin row we will want to use then a table dot row. So right here, get rid of all of this. So importing the table, and then again table dot row. Just like this, and then we can get rid of the one that we already have. So let's just comment this out. And so with this, we then duplicate this duplicate logic of defining the columns. So we have that now in one central place, which is in this table. And so let's go there and actually accept that. So the columns, and of course also the children, because otherwise we can then not display them. So we're going to have a child component called header, as we already saw. So this one also needs to take in the children. Then we will have a row and also a body and even a footer. But a footer, let's do it differently. So then let's also again define them right here. So table.header is the header. Table.body is the body component. Table.row is or a row component. And finally, table.footer can be just the footer component that we have here. So just the styled component, because we don't need to add any logic to this one. So the footer has no columns. So the ones that do have columns is the header and the row. And so now we need to give these two components here access to these columns. And so since we are using a compound component, you already know how that's going to work. So we will create a table context here. So create context. And then here, all we will do is to return that. So table context dot provider, where the value is simply going to be an object with these columns. And then here we return the styled table. And then in there is where all the children will live. So this styled table we of course already have here. And so it simply gives a few, or actually it's not even that one. So it's here, and it gives, just some base styles there. So here, let's then also give it the role of the table. So for accessibility reasons, as we discussed earlier, and then here we can give this access to the columns through the use context hook. So const columns use context and then table context. And then here, all we do is to return the styled header component that we already have. Then here, we also give it the role of a row. And most importantly, then here we pass in the columns prop. All right. And then we pass the children. So the important part here is this columns prop. So let's go to the styled header and see what that actually does. And here we are. So this is built based on a common row. Let's go there. And so indeed, here is where the grid template rows are defined. And so they will come from props.columns. So it's going to be that string that we pass here. So we pass this into the table. Then that table receives it as the prop and passes it into the context. And so then all the child elements can read that value from the context and then pass it into their styled component. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And so with this, we can do exactly the same thing with the row, with the difference that here it is the styled row. Then the body, let's leave for later. And then let's reload and see what kind of error we got there. And well, apparently no error at all. So it is already working, apparently. Let's just check out the markup here, just to see if we actually have the correct roles set up. And indeed, the whole thing here is a table. Then this header is a row, and then the other ones are also rows. Great. Now maybe we can make this here as a header. So let's try that. I'm not even sure if that's going to work, but we can use the as prop, remember? So here we can then change the HTML element. So let's see. So now that's gone again for some reason. And indeed, now that became a header. So that's then a bit more semantic again. So making this here the header of the table. So just as a nice experiment. All right. And so this is working just great. And it's ready to be reused in other tables as well. Let's just do some experiment here. So if we change this, then indeed, this last column here gets a lot more space. So exactly like we wanted. It changes both in the header and in each individual table row as well. Now the only thing that's left to do is the actual table row, which will basically sit right here. And so let's actually leave that for the next lecture. Let's now come back to a small use case of the render props pattern to implement our table's body. Now we could use this table body just like this. So we can do table.body and then place all the content in there. So that would definitely be an option. And then in here, simply render the children prop. However, this is kind of ugly, I would say, and we can do it in a much better way. So instead, what we want to do is not this, but actually have this as a self-closing element. And then we simply want to pass in the cabins data. So here, let's say that the data is cabins. And then we also need to pass in basically the instructions on how this table.body should actually render the data. And so that's where the render prop pattern comes into play. So again, right now we are passing the data into this table.body, but it doesn't really know what to do with this data, right? I mean, it might know, or it will know, that this is an array, and so it will probably loop over that array, but then it doesn't know what to do with it. And so, again, here we can now specify the render prop. And so this is where we then tell the component what to do with each cabin. And so that's essentially this part right here. So let's grab that. And then we can get rid of this. And then I think that this looks a lot nicer and a lot cleaner as well. So a lot more reusable even. And so now let's, well, not here, but here. So let's come here and then actually not accept the children, but the data and the render prop. And so let's say return the styled body. So this will just add some padding to the interior. And then in here, we will take the data and map over it. And for each of them, all we will do is to call the render prop. And that's actually it. Now, just to finish, let's also account for the possibility that there is no data at all. So let's say the data length is 0, or we could, of course, also just do this. And so in this case, so for that, we have the empty styled component here. So let's say no data to show at the moment. And so now we are back to working. Let's inspect the HTML itself. And so indeed, now here we have this section. So this body is a section and it has this very tiny padding there. So just a small visual effect. So we have this header, which is a row, and we have the section, which is basically a collection of some more rows. And again, for this, we leveraged the render prop. So sometimes it doesn't need to be something as big as in the example as I showed you earlier. So when we first talked about the render props pattern, but even something like this still qualifies as the render prop. And so I really believe that definitely you should have this kind of tool in your toolbox. So being able to do something like this and also being able to understand it when you see it in other developers' code. But anyway, with this, we finish our reusable table. And so next up, let's move on to still work with some more compound components, where we will finally fix this part right here. So building a reusable menu component. So see you there soon. Our last use case of the compound component pattern will be to build a reusable context menu, which will make our application really feel like an actual application that you use every day on the web. And this will be a long one, but let's still do it all in one go. So what we want to do here is to give each of these cabin rows a button here that we can click. And then when we click that button, a small context menu appears, which ultimately will contain these 3 actions here. So duplicating, editing, and deleting. Now what's special about these menus is that only one of them can be open at the same time, which means that we need to wrap the entire table here into that menus component that we are going to build. And then inside each of the rows, we will have a menu child component. All right. And so let's actually write that in our code. So we already have, again, the table component right here, or actually not table, but menus. So that's what we're building this time. And so let me immediately create the function component here. And then for now, I will just return the children. All right. And so as I was saying, we actually need to wrap everything here. So all the rows inside those menus. so that those menus can then keep track which of the 4 menus, so 4 right now because we have 4 rows, and so again that menus need to keep track which of the 4 menus are actually opened at the time. So let's come to our cabin table, and as I said, we will then wrap all of this into that menus component. Let's place that here at the end, and nice. So for now, nothing happens here, of course, but now inside the table body, inside of each cabin row, we will have a menus.menu. So let's come here, and for now, we will place this here after all of this stuff. So after this modal, we will have, as I just said, one menus.menu. And we need to import this menus component here, of course, as I just did initially. So very important that we have this one here. And so now let's again build out the API of this component that we want to implement. And this one is going to be a very complex one. So this lecture here will be the hardest one of this section. And so if it's too much, then that's absolutely no problem at all. This is really, really advanced stuff already, but the reason for that is that we are already approaching the end of the course, and many students have asked me for advanced content like this. And so I'm basically giving it to you. And also you might be noticing that at this point, it is not so much about React itself anymore, but really more about application development itself. And things are also getting a bit more opinionated. So many of these things are basically my way of doing things and with my opinion in them. But of course, I tried to make it as general and as broad as possible so that all of you can learn a lot from this and use it in your own applications in the future. All right, but with all that being said, let's now see what we need inside a menu. So a menu, as you have seen many times on the web already, is always composed of a button. And so then when you click on that toggle button, a list will open. And then that list itself is composed of many buttons. So let's do that. So we will have a menus.toggle, which we can use to open and close this menu right here. And then we will have a menu.list, which will then contain a bunch of buttons. So menu.button. So basically, each of them will be one list element of the list. And so here, let's just write something for now. So let's say duplicate, then edit, and then delete. Now, just like before with the modal, we will have many of these menus on the page, and therefore many toggles and many lists. And so therefore, we will have to connect this toggle with this list again, so that we know that this exact toggle should then open up this list. So previously we used the name and the opens prop, but here let's make it a bit more simple and simply use an ID. So for this, we will just use the current cabin ID. So both on the toggle and on the list. So cabin ID, and then the parent menus component will keep track which of the menu ID is currently being displayed. All right. And for now, I think that's it. So later we will pass in some more props, but for now, we can work with this. So we have a menu, a toggle, a list, and a button. And so let's come to our menus here and implement those. So the menu we actually don't really need, because all that is some styling. So this one right here. So actually let's change this just to menu. All right. And so here let's then implement the toggle, which remember has an ID. Then we have the list itself, which also needs an ID. And finally, we have the button. So for now, no props, but yeah, we are going to need the children for sure. And so now in the end, let's do menus.menu is equal menu, which, as I mentioned earlier, is simply that styled component. Then we have the toggle. Then we have the list. And finally, also the button. All right. And then next up, as always, let's create our menus context. And then here, as we already mentioned earlier, we will need to keep track which one is the currently open ID. So, of course, we use some state for that. And then here, let's, as always, return menus context.provider. And then in here, we provide the open ID and later also some setter functions. And let's actually immediately create those setter functions. So here by default, we start off with an empty string. And so that basically means that none of the menus is currently open. And so basically that means that the close function is to set the open ID to that empty string. On the other hand, the open function is simply exactly the same as set open ID. So just like we did earlier also in the modal component. So let's pass these down in here as well. And then let's build out our other three components. And let's begin with the easiest one here. So for now, here we will simply return a list item because this will be inside the list, remember? And so this will be an unordered list. So here, to be semantically correct, we need a list item, and then in there, we will have a styled button. And so for now, all we're going to do is to pass in the children. So this is the easy one. Let's now tackle the two complicated ones. So here we want to return the styled toggle. And please make sure to always check out these styles here, because otherwise this is all going to feel even more like black magic. And the same, of course, is true for the other components that we built previously. So we cannot build all the styles here in the videos, because then this project will be like 50 hours long, and that we can't have. But anyway, let's here create a function called handle click, which we will call. And actually, let's only specify it here like this for now. And then here we will want an icon. So this one is called HI, then ellipsis vertical. So it's like these three dots that I'm sure you have seen before. Here then let's create that handle click function. And so here is where we will then decide whether we want to open or to close the menu, or actually the list. So let's grab those two, or actually all the values. So we need both the ID and the close and the open functions in order to do this decision. And so we get them from use context on the menu context. All right. And so here, let's now do the check. So if the open ID is empty, meaning that there is no ID, or if the open ID, so basically if the currently open menu is different from the ID of this exact button that is being clicked, then let's open the menu. And we do this by passing in the ID of exactly this button, because this button is connected to that menu by this ID. And otherwise, we just close the menu. So again, if right now none of the menus is open, which is what we have right here, so then open this one. So the one with the ID that has been clicked. Or also, if there is currently an open menu already, but it's different than the one that's being clicked, then we also want to open this one. So the one that has been clicked. But in all other cases, then we just want to close it. So that other case is basically whenever the open ID is equal to this ID. Or in other words, whenever the menu is already open. So if we then click again, we close that. And this will all make sense once we see this here actually working. But for that, we need to also finish this list component. So I believe that this one for now will just work bare bones. And so let's move on to the last one. So here from the context, we will need the open ID. So menu context, because now we need to compare that open ID with the ID of this list. So basically just like before with the modal window, where we compared the window name with the currently opened name. And so here we now have to do exactly the same thing. So basically, if the currently open ID is different from this list ID, then return nothing. But if the ID of the list matches the one that is currently open, then we want to render something. So then we do render this list of buttons. And so here, let's actually again return a portal. So create portal, because this element here will also float on top of the UI. And so in cases like that, it's always a good idea to use a portal. So here we will have our JSX, which is the styled list for now. And then in here, we will pass the children, which are going to be all of these buttons, if you remember from here. So we have the list, and that receives these buttons. So those are their children. Just like this. And then the second argument of the portal, let's again do document.body. Okay, but now let's actually go check out this styled list, because there is something very particular about it. So this styled list here is with the position of fixed. So just like the modal window before. And what is special here is the fact that the right and the top CSS properties come from the position prop. So basically here we need to pass in the X and the Y coordinates of this menu, because we will want it to be displayed exactly below the button that will appear there. So we will have to later calculate that position, but for now, while we are still experimenting around with this, let's just do some fictional position. So here, this expects an object with X. Let's set it to 20 and Y also to 20. All right. Now here, I'm not sure why we're getting this error, but, well, it is actually menus, not just menu. And we have an error, but that's no problem. I'm sure we can fix it. So that's a lot of errors, 77. Let's go all the way to the top. So here it says we maybe forgot to export some component. Let's see what we have next. And okay, let's see if that's the case. Here it's menus. So maybe that's the only problem, but I don't believe that. Or, well, actually it looks like it. So here we have a nice looking button. And so let's check what happens when we click it. Well, beautiful. There is our list. Let's click it again, and then it disappears. Great. So something is already working here. Let's click here, and it shows up again. Click here, and it closes. And also, if we click this one, and then another one, well, now we can't really see, because it appears in the same place. But trust me that it did close, and then open another one. Great. So we have some bare bones functionality here already working. And so next up, let's make this a little bit nicer. So add a few more features there. And starting with the actual positioning of the list. Now this position of the list needs to be calculated as soon as this button here is clicked. And so let's do that right here in handle click. So first off, here let's receive the event that has been fired off, so that click event. And so then on that, we can do e.target, and then we want to get the closest button. So just to make sure that we really get the position of the button and not of the SVG icon here. So this then basically does some DOM traversing, finding the closest button parent. And then here we can then call another DOM function, which is get bounding client rect. So weird name, but basically what this will do is to give us some data about the element's position. Let's call it rect for rectangle. And then let's start by just logging this to the console. So each time we click here, then we get an error. So it's get bounding. Let's try that again. And nice. So here we get now the X and Y positions. And so based on that, we can now determine where we want to render the list. So let's get that data, but where should we actually store it? Because we will determine the data here in this component, but we do actually need it here. So in order to pass it from one place to another, we will store it in the parent's state. So let's create position and set position, use state again, and let's start with null. And then we also pass these two into our context. So position and set position. Then here we grab that, set position, and then here let's do set position. And as before, we are expecting an object with X and Y. Now here I already figured out how to calculate this. So it's going to be the window's width, basically, minus the width of the rectangle itself, and minus the X coordinate of the rectangle. So I cannot really explain why that is, but if you think about this, then you will actually figure out the exact same thing. And now for the Y position, all we need to do is to take the rectangle's Y position. So basically that's up here. Then we will add the height of the button, which will leave us up here. And then we just add some pixels for margin. So rect.height and then plus 8 pixels. All right. And again, please try to understand that positioning there. But anyway, here we now grab that position and pass that in here. And so now, let's see. Yeah, great. So the same now here and here and here. Beautiful. There's just one problem with this, which we are actually not going to fix because it takes too much time, which is if we scroll now, then the menu will stay at the same position on our screen because it has the fixed position. So we could, of course, fix this, but that's just a bit too hard. So I'll just leave it like this, click here to close it. And so this is really good enough for what we are building here, or what we are actually just learning here. Okay. Next up, let's make these buttons here a bit nicer. And for that, we will want to pass in an icon. So we want to allow an icon. And so let's use the same ones that we used here earlier. So this one for duplicating. And then let's do the same thing in the other ones. So here it's hi pencil. And here it is hi trash. Now, of these three buttons right there, only one of them has an on-click handler, I believe. Yeah, just this one right here. And so actually we want our buttons right there to also be able to receive this on-click. So it's not mandatory, but they can receive it. And so let's grab this here as well and then place it right here. So now it's getting a bit hard to find. Let's add some spacing here maybe. So that's better. So let's now handle that icon and on-click prop on here. So icon and on-click. So first off, let's place that icon here and then placing this children here into a span. All right. Then here, let's use on-click and then a function called handle-click. So let's define that here again, because we actually need to do multiple things. So first of all, we want to conditionally call on-click. And for that, again, we use optional chaining. And then afterwards, we also want to close our menu. So let's call close. And then, of course, we need to get it from the context. Use context like this with the menu's context. And there we go. Let's see. And beautiful. So this is starting to really look like something. And actually this button should already be working. So let's click that. And indeed, our copy of one has been created. Great. Now these two here don't work yet, but if we click them, then the menu gets closed already. So that part of closing already works. Now what we also want to do is that when we click outside here, just like with the modal, we want the menu to close. So right now, of course, that doesn't happen. But luckily for us, we already have that use outside click hook. So we can use that here because this is where we want to register that click. So if we click outside of this list, then we want it to close. So this is going to return a ref. So use outside click, and then the handler here in this case will again be our close function. So let's grab that, and then we just need to attach this ref here to this element. So let's try that. And it seems to be working. So we click outside, it disappears. And as we click here, then that also disappears. Let's just try to see what happens if maybe we pass in false here for that second argument, so that list and capturing. And so, well, now that doesn't work at all. And so we again need this here to be true, basically. All right. And so now this works really, really great. So I'm really happy with the result and with the way this looks like. Now, all we need to do is to actually place these actions here in there. So making the edit and the delete work, because the menu itself is, I think, finished. So it's a big one and it was a lot of work, as I said, but the result is really satisfying, I think. But anyway, now we will need to change this a lot. So if you want to keep the old version, I will just duplicate this here, again calling it version 1. And in this one, we can even completely get rid of what we did here. So we should have taken that copy earlier, but we can just do it now as well. Now, okay. And so now comes the time where things will get really, really confusing. So the first button here we actually no longer need. So that one is already working. But now as for these other two, this is where it gets complicated. So we already have some buttons right here, but these buttons are not that pretty. So they're just these buttons. And so we actually want these buttons to be these ones right here. So these menu buttons should be inside this modal.open. So here we will now basically mix the two together. So again, that will be quite confusing, but let's do it. So we should actually grab all of this stuff here, or maybe even everything. So even where we open the menu. So let's grab that and place it still again inside the modal. So the modal should be outside. Yeah, so right now it's not. That's why we get that error. But there we go. All right. And so now we can do what we just said earlier. So we can grab these buttons right here and place them into modal.open. So this one we actually don't need, but this one we need. So this one is for edit. So let's grab this and place it right here. So just like this. And then we take the entire thing and put it back into our menus list. All right. And then we do the same thing with the other one. So let's grab this modal.open, place that here, and then we replace that button in there with the button of our menu. Just like this. And so now these two windows here are a bit separated, but that's no problem at all. It's going to work just exactly the same way as before. So let's just recap. So we have, of course, our menus.menu, which is now inside the modal. Then we have the toggle, then we have the list. And then for two of them, so for two of the buttons, we have them inside modal open, because these two should actually trigger our modal windows to open. All right, that's no problem at all. And then we have these two windows here outside of the menu list. And I believe that this is actually all. This should work perfectly fine. So let's try to edit. And beautiful. So this is so great. Like, it makes me really happy to see this working so nicely. The same thing for deleting. Let's close this one. If I try to edit this one, then we will get the 8 here. Yeah. So everything, again, working perfectly fine. We can click outside here. We can open the menu, also click outside. And so this is really just a great experience and a great design as well. So congratulations for reaching the end of this pretty advanced section right here. So this was really fun for me, and I hope that you feel the same. So study all that we did here, and then we can move on together and build out the rest of the application right in the next section.